Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being with us today. We appreciate it very much. We've read a lot and heard a lot about this rebalance towards Asia, and we've seen some actions in that regard. Of course, we're reevaluating our defense relationship with Japan and seeing how we can increase cooperation. They've got some internal constitutional issues they have to work through, but we've seen that. We've certainly seen a reinvigoration of our, or a re-upping of our situation with South Korea, and of course have a free trade agreement with them. And even with the Philippines, there's now talk about creating a rotational presence in terms of the U.S. being involved. We know they've now gone to arbitration on their claims with regards to China. So we've seen activity there. Tell us a little bit, what is the role of Taiwan in the U.S.'s rebalance or pivot towards Asia?
Thank you very much, Senator, for all of your work on these issues and for your thoughtful question. The Obama administration has placed a high priority on strengthening our unofficial relations with Taiwan as part of our overall rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region, in part because Taiwan shares our values and our commitment to democracy, in part because of the important history and ties that bind us, but also in part because of the dynamism and potential of the Taiwan economy. And therefore, our security cooperation, our economic cooperation, our people-to-people, and other forms of cooperation, including multinational cooperation, has continued to grow, and we see further room to grow. One outstanding example has been the role that Taiwan played in assisting in the relief efforts in response to Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. Another is the readiness with which Taiwan responded to the loss of Malaysian Air Flight 370 and actively contributed initially to the search and rescue efforts. We have reached an agreement last year on a visa waiver program status for Taiwan that has opened the door to tourism and the people-to-people exchange that will deepen ties and benefit the U.S., including through educational exchange. The TIFA talks that begin again in Washington tomorrow help us strengthen and expand our economic relationship. And the former Vice President of Taiwan, Vincent Hsiao, late last year led an extraordinary delegation of top CEOs interested in finding ways to expand investment in the United States. So I think that the economic connection between the U.S. and Taiwan relates directly to the economic underpinnings of our rebalance.
Well, because I don't want to run out of time, let me ask you in specific, because the world, everything is interrelated. I would venture to guess, and in fact, I'm pretty sure of the fact that Taiwan has watched with great interest what's happened with Crimea, where both the economic leverage that Russia has on Europe as a whole, and in particular on Ukraine, and of course its military abilities in comparison to the Ukraine, allowed Russia to basically invade and take a piece of land away from a neighbor and annex it and basically occupy it as they do today. And I would venture to guess that the similarities for the Taiwanese is pretty striking to the fact that in Taiwan, for example, even as early as last year, or as late as last year, our own defense analysis found that the primary purpose behind military investment by China is to prepare for a conflict in the Taiwan Straits. So what are we doing in that regard to ensure that that calculation does not change to the point where China believes they can move aggressively on retaking Taiwan without having any sort of consequence for it? In essence, their belief that they could pretty much replicate what Russia did to Crimea. What steps have we taken to ensure that that does not happen, that that balance is not unsettled to the point where you're actually inviting China to do something like that?
Thank you, Senator. First and foremost, the key underpinning of our policy, rooted in the TRA, is our opposition to any effort to resolve the differences pertaining to Taiwan through intimidation, through coercion, or through military force. And maintenance of peace and stability in the cross-straits is a top priority. That's why the Obama administration, long before the crisis in Crimea. The beginning of the president's first term has taken such robust steps to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability, and by providing arms of a defensive character. The Obama administration has notified over $12 billion in arms sales to Taiwan already. And at least as important, the U.S. has intensified our dialogue and consultations with Taiwan on defense issues and on defense strategy. We similarly have a robust dialogue with China. Now, we do not, as a matter of policy, ever discuss or consult in advance with China regarding weapon sales to Taiwan or possible sales. But we do discuss the situation in the Strait regularly with China and make very clear to them our commitment not only to One China policy and the 3 U.S.-China joint communiques, but also to the Taiwan Relations Act.
Well, I don't know if we're going to do a second round, so there's not that many folks here, but let me just ask you this, and again, because the world is interrelated. If, in fact, the United States reaches an agreement with Iran that allows Iran to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium, what would then, at that point, how would we go to Taiwan and say, you should never do this, however? We allow our enemies and our adversaries to enrich and to reprocess, but our friends like you who are similarly threatened, or feel threatened, I should say, are not allowed to provide. And how do we go to Taiwan or Korea or Japan, for that matter, and argue to them that they should continue to walk away from a nuclear weapons capability or an enrichment capability when we're basically, if in fact we acquiesce to other countries with hostile intentions having that sort of capability?
Senator, I don't accept the premise that the security of either Taiwan or Japan or Korea would be enhanced by an advancement of their, or transformation of their peaceful civil nuclear programs into a nuclear weapons programs. And I see no evidence that the leaders in Taiwan or Japan or Korea are of that view either. In the case of Taiwan, as I said, we have an extensive ongoing set of consultations regarding Taiwan's legitimate self-defense needs. It begins with the software. It begins with the strategy. And we have significantly advanced our discussions about the steps that Taiwan can and should take with regard to recruitment, retention, doctrine, asymmetric warfare capabilities, and decisions about necessary weapons flow from that strategy. More broadly, I think that the lesson that our allies, Japan and Korea, derive from the Iran experience is that strong unity and resolve can compel an unwilling nation to make the decision to pursue serious negotiations as the way out. And this very much informs our approach and our strategy to North Korea, which is perhaps the closest analogy.
And by the way, I don't dispute that the current leadership in South Korea and Japan and Taiwan do not want to pursue a weapons program, but I think that's largely built on the security assurances that the U.S. has historically made to all 3 of those countries over time. And I would just say that if over time those assurances erode, either because our own capabilities are eroded through budget cuts and other means, or because they come to question how committed the U.S. is to actually following through on these sorts of things, I think that people's calculations could change, and that's a concern that I have about the region as a whole. I mean, it's not, there's a reason why both India and Pakistan now have nuclear weapons. There's multiple examples around the world where countries decide that they must provide for their own security. And I point to the situation in Crimea simply because the Ukraine possessed the world's 3rd largest nuclear weapons stockpile at the end of the Cold War, and decided to walk away from that on assurances from the United Kingdom, the United States, and Russia that that coalition would provide for their security. As it turns out, one of the three countries that was supposed to provide for their security ended up invading them. So I do think that over time this could have an impact on the thinking of leaders, and I just think that's important for us to keep in mind as we discuss why it's so important for the U.S. to have a robust commitment and capability to provide the mutual defense of our allies in the region, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. And that was the point I was trying to get to, is if in fact that is ever eroded, in combination with any sort of agreement that allows hostile countries to enrich or reprocess, it could lead countries to conclude in the future that perhaps they're on their own. And if they're on their own, then they may need to pursue these sorts of what they would view insurance policies.
Senator Rubio, I think you're making an extraordinarily important point, and I could not agree more that the credibility and the sustainability of the U.S. commitment that the Asia-Pacific is a strategic priority, and that our presence, including as a security guarantor, is not in question, is a paramount objective for U.S. foreign policy and for the Obama administration. That conviction underlies the President's decision to travel later this month to Japan, to Korea, to Malaysia, to the Philippines, three treaty allies and a close friend and security partner of the United States. We are determined, for the reasons that you stated, and simply for the longer-term U.S. interest, to demonstrate our resolve and the robustness of our active engagement and participation, both as a security partner and as an economic partner.
Yeah, sure. No, go ahead.
Do you want me to, here's my last question. It's not an unreasonable hypothetical. So, for example, this will have an impact on the whole region, but this is a region you oversee in general. So, as you're aware, the Philippines is currently involved in a dispute with China over some territory. And as a result, they have taken that case to arbitration before a panel that I believe, will rule in their favor, or their hopeful will. The Chinese, of course, have made very strong threats against that and what that could mean. Do you believe it is possible that at any time in the near future we could see China by force take these territories that they're disputing now with the Philippines? And if so, if they did so, what do you think the U.S. response would be, and how would that be viewed by Taiwan and others in the region in particular? What impact would that have? If in fact, let me ask it this way. If in fact China basically just by force took Scarborough away from the Philippines and nothing happened, there was no impact of it, and as I've heard some say, we're not going to go to war over some rocks, how would that impact the thinking in Taiwan and in other nations in the region with regards to the U.S. security commitment?
Well, Senator, as your question implies, there is no doubt but that the U.S. allies in the region watch carefully how we are dealing with China in areas of potential dispute, the Taiwan Straits being one, the East China Sea and the South China Sea being others. Right now, the South China Sea and the East China Sea have heated up. And there is a particular focus by the Chinese, who are deploying large numbers of Coast Guard vessels to the area of the Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines has since 1999 maintained an outpost, and conducting problematic behavior, including efforts to interfere with and interdict the routine resupply of the small garrison at that outpost. Without treading on the treacherous ground of answering a hypothetical question per se, let me tell you this. I know that the President of the United States and the Obama administration is firmly committed to honoring our defense commitments to our allies. There should be no doubt about the resolve of the United States. We stand by our allies and we stand by our commitments. That said, there is no reason why the issues pertaining to the South China Sea cannot be resolved through peaceful means. Diplomacy is the preferred vehicle, and when diplomacy doesn't yield results, states parties to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea have the legitimate right to access the existing international legal mechanisms. That access, the filing of a claim under the tribunal at UNCLOS, occurred last weekend and is perhaps the proximate reason why the Chinese are expressing their anger and discontent on the sea through what to us appears to be intimidating steps. The President of the United States met with President Xi Jinping of China in The Hague earlier this month. He has had something on the order of 17 or 18 meetings with Chinese presidents and prime ministers since he took office. To the best of my knowledge, in every single meeting, President Obama made clear to his Chinese counterparts that the use of force, the use of coercion, the threat of force, and other means of intimidation are unacceptable as vehicles for advancing China's territorial claims. And the President has left the Chinese leadership in no doubt of our resolve. Now, all that said, Senator, the fact is that there are diplomatic steps underway between China and the 10 ASEAN countries. There are also important discussions underway among the 4 ASEAN claimants themselves. We're confident that there are diplomatic paths to move forward on the disputes relating to the South China Sea, and we hope, although we don't take a position on the claims, that the net effect of the Philippine filing in the tribunal will be to encourage China to clarify its own claims in ways that are consistent with international law and remove the ambiguity that is destabilizing in our view.
Yeah.
I just have one final kind. I forgot. Sorry, I neglected to ask. We were having a good conversation about the other issues. But does the Obama administration remain committed to President Reagan's so-called 6 assurances to Taiwan? Is that still our position?
Senator, thank you. The underpinning of our policy is our One China policy, the 3 U.S.-China joint communiques, and the Taiwan Relations Act. But the quote-unquote 6 assurances that you're referring to continue to play an important part as an element of our approach to Taiwan and the situation across the strait.
All 6 of them remain the policy of the United States?
What I would say, Senator, is that in the context of the agreements that I mentioned, what's known as the 6 assurances comprise an ongoing element of our approach to the Taiwan question.
I guess my concern now is why can't the answer be yes, all 6, we remain committed to all 6 of them as elements of our foreign policy? Why are you unable to say that?
Well, what I'm trying to communicate, Senator, is that the underpinning of our approach to Taiwan is the One China policy, the 3 communiques, and the Taiwan Relations Act. That having been said, what's known as the 6 assurances, which date back to the Reagan administration, as you say, are things that we take seriously and remain important elements as we formulate practical policies vis-a-vis.
Yeah, I'm concerned about the answer because on a number of occasions after meeting with the President, the Chinese have actually misrepresented. In fact, in one instance, the Chinese actually said that the U.S. policy towards Taiwan was evolving and changing. And so I understand you're not the decision maker about what our policy is, but I must say I am concerned that I'm unable from the administration today to get a statement that the 6 assurances remain, all 6 remain things we are firmly committed to, as opposed to simply things that inform us or elements of our policy. So I am not wrong then to leave here today and say that all 6 assurances remain elements of our policy, but they are no longer necessarily the cornerstone of our policy, or that the administration is not prepared to say that we remain committed to all 6 in their totality, as understood by President Reagan when he enunciated them.
I'm not familiar with categorical statements of that nature in this or in recent administrations, and I think, Senator, that it's wisest to approach the challenges of Taiwan based on the agreements and the legislation that I've described, but mindful of the important elements that are captured in what you refer to as the 6th Agreement, including, for example, principles that we continue to abide by, such as our unwillingness to engage in any sort of prior consultations or discussions with the Chinese regarding arms sales, just as an example.
All right, so let me just ask this. It continues to be the policy of the United States that we will maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people on Taiwan? That remains our policy?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Thank you. And I too have to go to a meeting, but there's a couple important questions that I wanted to ask you. First, and Senator Cardin just outlined this, I wanted to get back to this topic of the 6 assurances under the Reagan administration, because I think they're, to be clear and unequivocal with regards to that, is critically important in terms of the message that we send and, quite frankly, the balance in the region. I asked that question of Secretary Russell a moment ago. You were both in the audience and you heard his answer. And I wanted to get your impressions after hearing. I tried multiple different ways to get someone from the administration to tell me that the 6 assurances remain the cornerstone of our policy and an important part of that we still stand by those assurances. I don't think I got that, and I wanted your interpretation of the answer that we got with regards to that question.
I was surprised that it wasn't a more direct response and that it couldn't be made in the affirmative. Certainly when we were in government, we would have said absolutely yes, and did on many occasions. So I hope the administration has the opportunity to clarify that, because I think the signal that it sends is a reassuring one if our friends in Taiwan know that they still apply in their totality, as your question asked.
Mr. Denmark, did you have a comment on the?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. I think the 6 assurances, as you said, are incredibly important in our relationship. While I certainly can't speak for the administration, it is my sense that U.S. policy regarding Taiwan, including the 6 assurances, have not changed. There were some public comments from other administration officials a few weeks ago on this topic, specifically after the Chinese Foreign Ministry misreported interactions between President Obama and President Xi, which stated explicitly that U.S. policy towards Taiwan had not changed. And I assume that that's still the guiding remarks from the administration.
Yeah, I would hope that that's the case. I again, tried on multiple occasions to get a direct answer, a yes or no. Yes, they remain part of our strategy, and it seems like there are elements of our strategy that might inform us, according to the answer that I got. And I hope we can bring some clarity to it, because I was surprised by the answer myself, and I felt that I didn't think it was a hard question. I just wanted to get it in the record. And unfortunately, we didn't get the answer we want, which I think actually is counterproductive. In fact, I think that in China, that answer that was given here today could potentially be misinterpreted as, in fact, an opening of some sort for a change in the U.S. posture towards Taiwan. I am very concerned about the answer that we got, and I hope that we can bring some clarity to it over the next few days. And I intend to ask that question as well in writing of the Secretary of State to get clear assurances that that remains a cornerstone of our policy. I wanted to ask one more question. Mr. Denmark, this ties to your statement, although I'd love to hear from both of you about it. You talked a little bit about the relations between Taipei and Beijing are generally very positive due to policy decisions of the leadership of both sides that since 2008 decided to reduce the tensions and focus on building economic and cultural ties. And you say in your written statement that Beijing initially approved of this approach with the expectation that improving cross-strait economic and cultural ties would gradually pull Taiwan more closely to the PRC's orbit, thus enabling eventual unification. Yet trends so far have not borne this out. And given, for example, even the events that are going on today with student protests regarding potential increased links with China, given that assessment, what impact do both of you think that now has on Chinese thinking? In essence, they've allowed this little opening to occur under the hopes that this would slowly but surely bring Taiwan closer to them until ultimately there would be a mutually agreed to unification. Now they're seeing this sort of dynamic internally where people are saying, we don't want to be closer to China. What impact could that have, in your mind, on how China approaches this relationship moving forward?
Thank you, Senator. It's a fascinating set of issues, a very difficult set of questions. Overall, my sense is that Beijing remains committed to its approach in terms of engaging Taiwan, although with all due caveats of anybody's ability outside of Zhongnanhai and Beijing to read the thinking and feelings of Chinese senior leadership. So with that as a caveat, my sense is that they remain committed to engagement because they do see benefits, political, economic, and strategic benefits for the engagement, but also the counterpart to it, the alternatives to that strategy, remain very unclear in terms of if they'd be more beneficial to China's overall strategy. My sense, talking to scholars in China and from what I've read coming out of China, is that there's a lot of focus on the results of the election in 2016. That there's a lot of concern in China that the election, that if the DPP were to win power back, that Taiwan may revert back to the policies of Chen Shui-bian. My sense is that the DPP is actually moving beyond that approach, that would probably not happen again if the DPP were to win the next election. The DPP is actually going through a process of internally thinking about its own cross-strait policy, its own approach to these issues, and is working on a new formulation. And my sense is that Beijing, should the DPP win, Beijing would try to find some way to continue to work with them, to continue this form of engagement. As Randy pointed out earlier, I think it's very important that there have been reports of the mainland attempting to influence elections, and I suspect that this would probably continue because they see the importance of the election to Taiwan's behavior, and how post-2016 the mainland may calculate its options, may calculate the continued attractiveness of this engagement strategy, I think is one too far for anybody to predict, especially outside of Zhongnanhai. But also the variables, the calculations are just far too complicated at this point to see really how Beijing may react to that scenario.
Thank you, Senator. I think China's policies haven't changed and probably won't for the foreseeable future, but with the trends in Taiwan, particularly the public polling about how people feel about their eventual status after the current status quo, one wonders, does Beijing have unlimited patience? I suspect they don't, because their ultimate objective appears to be getting further away. Their ultimate objective is clear. They want unification, or what they call reunification. The polling suggests that goal is getting further away, which is why I think our support for Taiwan's security needs remain very relevant even in this era when there's improvements in the cross-strait political and economic relationship. If Beijing understands its policies aren't bringing it closer to its ultimate objective, then the option of the use of force could become more attractive, particularly if we're not doing our part in helping Taiwan with its defense needs.
Well, and that, first of all, I appreciate both of you being here today, and thank you for your testimony, and thank you for your time. That is exactly our concern, that any sort of weakening or questioning or equivocation on the part of U.S.'s stance towards Taiwan, in fact, invite miscalculation or recalculation on the part of the Chinese. And if people think that what's happening in Crimea is complicated, they have no idea what any sort of territorial dispute in this part of the world would look like. It would be incredibly destabilizing, would have an immediate impact on the way Japan and South Korea and other nations portray themselves. And I think the two nations who right now feel the most immediately threatened by the aggressiveness of the Chinese government. One is the Philippines, because they simply don't have the capability, and the other is Taiwan. And it is, I think, that any sort of weakening or any sort of confusion about where the U.S. stands and our commitment to this relationship invite potential aggressiveness and aggression in a way that could end up finding us in a conflict that's much more complicated and, in fact, much more dangerous than even what we're seeing around the world today. So, again, I thank you both for being here and for your time and for your testimony. The record for this hearing will remain open until the close of business Friday. Members and others will be allowed to submit stuff for the record or ask questions, and I would just ask your cooperation that if you receive any questions between now and Friday, that you would answer them for the committee promptly so we can include it in our record. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.